I once forgot how to tie my shoes. I was at a party not too many years ago, so I was already a grown-up person. I think it was a carnival party, so we had to wear masks. And I went outside to get some fresh air, so I took my mask off. And when I was putting it on again, I was talking with somebody, so I was distracted while I was tying it at the back of my head, so I couldn't get the knot working at the first attempt. And then I made a huge mistake. I told myself, okay, no problem, let's focus and let's try and tie it again. And by doing so, I began thinking analytically about every stage of the process of tying a knot, which is an action so natural that I never thought about it in such an analytical way. And so, to my surprise, I forgot nearly every single stage of the whole process of tying a knot. And think about it yourself. If you have to describe just by words to somebody who doesn't know how to tie a knot, how would you do? Yeah, but don't worry, now I know how to tie my shoes again. After the few first moments of disorientation, I relearned again from scratch until it became natural again. But the point is this: when we make music, we rely on the idea of rhythm more or less in the same way. It is something so natural and instinctive that we rarely ask ourselves what it is and why it is. So today I would like to do this thing. I would like to momentarily forget how to rhythm and then learn again step by step until it becomes natural again. The title of this video contains the terms rhythm, meter, and tempo. So I would like to start by defining what rhythm is and what meter is. So if we Google rhythm, we find these definitions: a stronger and regular repeated pattern of movement or sound, the measure of the flow of words and phrases in verse or prose as determined by the regulation of long and short or stressed and unstressed syllables, more on this later on, and a regularly recurring sequence of events or processes. It's okay, but I want to dig deeper. The word rhythm comes from the ancient Greek word rhythmos, which meant more or less the same thing that we said before. It is of uncertain etymology, but some refer it to the verb reo, to flow, same as the famous expression pantarei, like everything flows. Extended Greek meanings include proportion, measure, symmetry, but also nature and shape. All these elements have in common the idea of order, that we can read in Plato's simple but strikingly effective definition of rhythm: tes kineseos taxis, order of motion. How do we achieve such order then? Well, the answer is by spacing events into precise segments of time, and we call those segments meters. Also, the word meter has its roots in ancient Greek language. It comes from the word metron, which broadly meant that by which anything is measured. So it is both the tool for measuring linear distances, but also the actual measured space, and by extension, the actual measured time, and finally, the poetic verses. If the difference between rhythm and meter may sound a little bit vague, don't worry, because so it did back in the days. So let us put Plato aside and jump forward by a few centuries to Quintilian, probably the greatest professor of rhetoric of the Roman Empire. In his Institutio Oratoria, he discusses the difference between rhythm and meter and calls in various factors, but probably my favorite definition is this one. Meter is concerned with words alone, while rhythm extends also to the motion of the body. It is basically the definition of feeling, and it also predates by thousands of years the hit song, "The Rhythm is a Dancer." So far, everything is nice and logical, but I think it's time to address the elephant in the room. All these fancy definitions rely on the idea of order. But what is that? It is something that we can see, hear, or touch. Bad news? No. The idea of order is something that is entirely in our head. If we have 4 apples scattered on the floor, or if we have 4 apples all lined up on the table, we still have 4 apples. Nothing has changed in the structure of the universe for what we know. Order is a matter of perception, so it is something inside us. It is a thought process that helps us making other thoughts faster. For example, after seeing the sun going up in the morning and down in the evening for a few days, we may guess that there is a recurring order in that, so we stop worrying about whether the sun will rise again tomorrow or not. It kind of eases our brain load. However, if we are caught in a rainstorm, we are a bit more alert because we don't know if it is going to worsen and when it is going to stop. So the sunrise and the sunset are predictable. They have an order and they have a rhythm, something that we can feel with our instinct. A rainstorm, on the other hand, is unpredictable, so it kind of forces our brain to think about that more thoroughly. In the same way, when we have a set of events recurring in time, we have a rhythm whose perception is inside us. So when we listen to a beat, after a couple of bars, our brain says, okay, that's a rhythm, I'm gonna stop thinking about that and just feel it. A century before Quintilian, Cicero, the greatest orator of the Republican Rome, in his work called Orator, says this: the ear, or at least the mind by the intervention of the ear, has a natural capacity to measure the harmony of language, and we accordingly feel that it instantly determines what is either too short or too long, and always expects that which is complete and well proportioned. Versification, therefore, and poetic competition was invented by the regulation of the ear and the successive observations of people of taste and judgment. So even the poetic verse wasn't discovered by an active intellectual effort, but merely by feeling and taste. And the reason came in afterwards by observing and improving and methodizing what has been observed by accident. According to Cicero, the observation of nature and the emotional response it caused into certain people made the people of taste and judgment understand what is pleasant and what is not, and so use those elements to create something not natural, something artificial, which, as the name suggests, is art. There is this idea that poetry was discovered by accident in Cicero's words, because we naturally produce some rhythmic arrangements while we speak. So the key elements about rhythm that we can get out of this introduction are that it has to be regular, recurring, and recognizable by heart. Meter, on the other hand, is something more technical that requires some degree of reasoning. We need to understand what is going on. For example, even if you don't know anything about music making, you can still tell when a song has rhythm and you can still dance to that. So even if something at first sight doesn't quite sound as rhythm, as soon as it is repeated a couple of times, it gets relocated in our implied musical grid. In Western music, as you may know, we have a few concepts that help us define the rhythm and the meter of a piece. The first one is the concept of note, which is the minimum musical event characterized by a duration and a pitch. The length of a note is never absolute, but it is expressed in fractions, like a half, 1/4, 1/8, and so on. But why we divide by 2 and not, let's say, 3 or 5? Probably because a binary rhythm, a rhythm consisting of 2 repeating units, is maybe the most immediate one. There is a lot of speculation as to why we enjoy so much the number 2, and a definition that I personally like a lot can be found in this book by Alfonso Traina on the Latin language. He says that 2 is the rhythm of the march, and since we have 2 feet, when we move, we naturally apply a binary rhythm. So take for instance the sound of the clock. In many languages and many cultures, the onomatopoeia for the clock is tick-tack or tick-tock. But the strikes are all the same. They all sound like tick, and we just couple them, but we can have much more complex rhythm that may group the notes into 3 or 5 or 7 or whatever. In the West, we generally call the beat the underlying metric structure of a piece. We measure it through the metric notation at the beginning of a staff, which says the number of notes after which our most primitive metric structure repeats. But even within a beat, we can have different rhythmic effects by combining longer and shorter notes. And the title of this video mentioned also a third word, which is tempo. Tempo basically defines how fast our rhythm goes. In the West, we use the concept of beat that we just saw, so the underlying rhythmic pulse of a piece, to define how fast or slow it goes by using something called BPM, which is the beats per minute. The name is pretty self-explanatory, so we take a single beat of a piece and we say, okay, how many of them can we fit in 1 minute? First of all, of course, we need to define to which note the beat refers to. So with this indication here, we know that in 1 minute we have 120 beats, which is like 2 per second. But we must always specify what kind of note we are taking as the main beat unit. For example, if we take the quarter note, we will know that in 1 minute we can have 120 quarter notes, so 248 notes, and so on. However, if we take the dotted quarter note, which is the basis for ternary rhythms, as we said, we will have 368 notes, and so on. But I would say we had enough of theoretical discussions for now, so I would like to take our modular synthesizer and put those things into practice. Let us take the Usta sequencer and create a new project. As you can see, the default value is 120 BPM and the ratio is 1:1, which means that the shortest possible note that Usta can play is equal to the clock impulse. If we calculate our clock on quarter notes, with this setting here, this is as much as we can get. However, if we need faster notes, we can take advantage of the clock to unit ratio to make Usta generate more notes in the space of a clock impulse. So for example, if we set the ratio to 1:2, Usta will generate 2 events per beat, and 3, and 4. And with this setting here, if our clock is calculated on quarter notes, these will be 16ths. Let us hear it. The notes all have the same duration, so we can say that they are isochronous. However, based on their melodic motion, it is very likely that we may perceive them as 4 groups of 4 notes. Let us add a kick drum to make this even clearer. However, let us try and remove 4 stages. The notes have the same duration as before, relative to one another, but they are just 12 instead of 16. Now it is more likely that we perceive the rhythm as 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3, a ternary rhythm, like this. Compare this to the previous one. As you can see, without any context, our brain tends to anchor the musical phrase to a regular and recognizable pattern, just like Plato, Cicero, or Quintilian told us. And if I remove one more stage, the overall number will be odd. Or even prime, like in this case, because we have 11 stages, and so our brain will struggle a bit more to understand it. However, if I play with the stage length parameter to make a few notes longer, either 2 or 3 times the minimum time unit, I will reach a total pattern length of 16, and so my pattern will become, again, an even beat. So even if my notes are 11, which is an odd number, my total length is now 16, so the brain can now relax and reduce the melody to a predictable binary structure. If the longer notes lie across a rhythmic impulse, we call it a syncopation. let us return to our isochronous melody where every note has the same duration. As we saw, the brain expects to reduce them to a regular pattern, and we can take advantage of this expectation and make this implied thought explicit, for example by using some longer gates to emphasize the crucial notes. Let us remove the kick drum. This is called articulation in the West, and we discussed it in other videos that I will link here and in the description. If we change this articulation, we may obtain different effects within our rhythm. Another articulation technique can be the dynamics, so making certain notes louder and or with a different timbre. For example, right now I am using an envelope to control the character knob, so besides the double articulation of my first gate pattern, some longer and some shorter, that control my ping circuit, so I'm acting both on the VCA and the VCF, I am using a second envelope to emphasize the character, so bringing in some degrees of distortion. Or I could have patched it, for example, on my brain sauce. And now I have two different gate patterns creating different effects, so different rhythmic motions. Because each gate pattern has, we can say, different metric structures that lie between one accent and the other. We can be more systematic and use those accents to create some rhythmic structure by faking different meters within our isochronous pattern of 16 notes. For example, by placing accents here, we can force our brain to perceive this rhythm instead of being 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4, something more like 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 2 plus 2. So you can see that in the previous example, the one of 11 notes, we had an odd number of stage, but with an even rhythm. And in the second case, we have an even number of stage with an underlying odd rhythm. There can be other fascinating ways to trick our brain, for example, by stacking different rhythmic structures. This technique is called polyrhythm, and we can obtain it on the Usta sequencer by setting the two tracks to two different ratios. For example, I will start by setting them both to 1:2. So it will sound like in 8 notes. And I will set just my second track to 1:3. And it will sound like this. Let's hard pan the two signals to make it more noticeable. So by doing so, we obtain the two or more, if we want, equally spaced rhythms that will reset on the same beat after a different number of stages. Another fascinating technique is the polymeter, which is stacking more musical structures of different lengths, but of the same rhythm. So let us go back to our two identical structures, and let's remove, let's say, one stage from track 2. Let's hard pan. Now the brain no longer knows what line to follow, and that's this beauty, but after a while they will start again on the same note, thus catching up. These two techniques teach us that while the brain may naturally expect some repeatability, the degree and the complexity of such ability is something that can be trained. We can also use the polymetric technique without having to use two melodies. So let us go back to our single melody isochronous 16-note pattern on track 1, and let's program a pattern of different length. So we are using a polymetric structure of 5 notes. I have 2 accents on the first and on the third. Please note that they have the same duration as the notes over track 1, but the pattern just has a different length. And I can patch these gates to an envelope and use this envelope to modulate my timbre, thus creating a kind of accents, just like the sound that we saw earlier. The accents that are polymetric, so they change every time. And the even structure of our pattern 1 that we can outline through a 4 on the floor pattern. So in this video, as the title says, we explore the rhythm, the meters, and the tempo. And in the practical section, we have seen step by step, pun not intended, what happens when we mix different meters and when we mix different rhythms. We still have to see what happens when we mix different tempos. So we can start with 2 isochronous melodies as we did before, and we can just set the BPM of one just slightly slower. They will start in unison and gradually drift apart. If we want to have a more subtle effect, we can take advantage of the fine BPM to reduce the gap between the two. The point is that sometimes the notes will play one on top of the other, and some other times they will be in the middle, so they will constantly create some ever-changing rhythms. The brain will struggle for a while to make sense of this new set, and it will progressively try to find new rhythmic structure. And I hope you found this introduction on rhythm and meter useful. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. I will reply to them, and if needed, I will also shoot another video. I will cap it here for today, and I will see you next time.